And this is going back to the what happens in the Kalam literature when Craig says, if the causal principle had been false, we'd have no explanation for why raging tigers don't come out of the void. Well, he's appealing to a principle like this, where he's saying, had the causal principle been false, then just anything, including raging tigers, could come into existence out of the void, and they could do so anywhere at any time. They could do so in any number, so you could have not just one raging tiger, but like 100.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Linford. He is lecturer at Old Dominion University, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. His work focuses on physics, philosophy of physics, philosophy of religion, and often how these things intersect. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Dan.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I think we're going to have a great discussion.
All right. So today we're going to be discussing your new article titled "Without Microphysical Causation, Just Anything Cannot Begin to Exist Just Anywhere." So to get into the article, I mean, maybe we could give a bit of an overview, or we could start with that. Like, what's the general?
Yeah, right. So what is the big picture? So, I first started thinking about these kinds of issues. Well, the particular way that I approached these issues in this paper, I first started thinking about when I was thinking about the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam argument isn't mentioned anywhere in this paper, and I don't cite anyone involved in that discussion in this paper, but that's part of where I first started thinking about these kinds of issues. So in the Kalam cosmological argument, the second premise of that argument says that anything that begins to exist is a cause. And ultimately, what the Kalam argument tries to do is to show that the universe has a cause. And so what I'm interested in this paper is this principle about whether anything that begins to exist, whether it must have a cause. That's a principle that throughout the history of philosophy, people have debated, particularly from the early modern period forward, not always in connection with the Kalam argument. So for instance, a bunch of the people who do matter for this paper, people like Thomas Hobbes and Jonathan Edwards, are people who were more concerned about the free will debate, actually. And it was out of the free will debate that their concerns come up. I'm more interested in just sort of the question about what explains the order that we find in the universe. Do we need causation to explain that order? So is it that in order to explain the order that we see in the universe, there has to be a cause for something to begin to exist? Or could we have an explanation of that order that doesn't appeal to causation? Now, there's a traditional kind of defense of the causal principle, which says that, well, had the causal principle been false, then there wouldn't have been an explanation for why various things either begin or don't begin to exist, right? So some people in the Kalam discussion, for instance, put it this way. So William Lane Craig will say, well, if the causal principle is false, then why aren't like raging tigers popping into existence out of the void? Now there's a position that's been around in philosophy of physics for a long time, a position called Neo-Russellianism. And it's a position that plausibly can be taken to entail that or to suggest at least that the causal principle is false, but that has an alternative explanation for the order that we find in the world. Importantly, and we'll get more into this, but it's a view on which determinism, for example, could be true. So it could be that everything that happens is determined, but what determines that things happen is not causation. So that's a kind of view that would provide an alternative kind of explanation for why some things do or do not begin to exist. And so why it is that raging tigers don't come at us out of the void, as it were. And then the other issue that I take up in the paper is really showing that there are these kinds of explanations already available within our most sophisticated physical theories, that it appears that Neo-Russellians already have the explanatory resources that they can offer, and that there are already examples that have actually been in the literature for quite some time of things that begin to exist for a reason, that there's an explanation for their beginning to exist, but that explanation is not a causal explanation. Anyway, so that's the broad overview of the topic. Maybe what we should do is next is like sort of getting into introducing something that I've called the Hobbes-Edwards-Prior principle.
Yeah, good. No, that's a great overview. I did want to stop a little bit on the causal principle itself,
Sure.
Because, well, maybe a couple of things to know. One of which you talk in the paper. There's different ways to interpret this principle, just how strong is it meant to be, and then maybe another concern, like when you mentioned William Lane Craig and others that have forward this sort of principle and their arguments. I mean, Craig's version, as you know, and some of the listeners may know, also imports certain other assumptions about what it means to begin to exist and so on. He assumes A theory as part of what it means to begin to exist. Right. So I don't know, maybe if you want to comment a bit on the connection there, and then how strong is this principle?
Yeah, I mean, right. So if we need additional metaphysical principles, let's say that something that begins to exist, like the A theory of time, for example, then the case for the causal principle becomes even weaker, right? Like, I mean, suppose that everything that exists has some finite extension to the past, but that the B theory of time is true, so the A theory isn't true. In that case, it would turn out that nothing begins to exist. Now, you might worry about whether that endangers the causal principle, but there's a way in which it does. There's a way in which it does and a way in which it doesn't. So the way in which it doesn't is that if it turns out that nothing at all begins to exist, then the causal principle is sort of trivially true or vacuously true, right? Because there's no items that begin to exist. There's nothing that would fail, nothing that would make the principle false, right? There's nothing that begins to exist without a cause, in other words, if there's nothing that begins to exist. Now, what I think Craig wants to be the case, though, is not just that the principle is vacuously true, but that the principle is substantively true. And if nothing at all begins to exist, then it would only be vacuously true. And in fact,
there's the second premise would be false, right? Or that the universe began to exist.
Yeah, that's right. That's the other problem, is that if the causal principle is only vacuously true, then the second premise, that the universe began to exist, would be false, right? So we'd have another reason to reject the Kalam cosmological argument in the case that the causal principle turns out to only be vacuously true. I think there was some other, right, so there's some other qualifications you want to make with respect to the causal principle, which is that something about how strongly do we want to take it. So you might think that that it's a necessarily true principle, that in any possible world where something begins to exist, that it has a cause. You might instead take it to be a very weaker principle, a principle according to which maybe it's only accidentally true of the actual world, but not true necessarily of any other possible world, that anything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, if it's so weak that it's a kind of accidental generalization, that it's only accidentally true of the actual world, but it could have been very easily otherwise, then it's difficult for me to see what justification we would have for believing in the causal principle in the first place. Right? And certainly someone like Craig wants it to be a kind of, like he calls it a metaphysical truth. I think he means something like a conceptual truth or something, that it's, it seems like he wants it to be some very strong kind of necessity involved, that it wouldn't be so easy for the principle to be false.
Right. Yeah, and I think, so that's the sort of, as I recall, you end up targeting the principle understood metaphysically as some sort of metaphysical principle, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right. So it should either be, I take it that it's either it's a gnomic principle, so it's true of physical necessity, or true of metaphysical necessity. There should be some necessity involved in the claim. If it was only accidentally true, I don't know why we would, like, how would we come to believe it? What would justify believing in it if it were only accidentally true? Because, in that case, it would just be some cosmic coincidence that everywhere that you look and find something that begins to exist, it happens to have a cause. And it wouldn't be the kind of principle that you could project, right? So in other words, you come across something new that you observe to begin to exist. Would you have reason to think that that thing also has a cause? Well, if it's not true of, if it's not at least physically necessary, well, then why would you think that that also holds in this new instance?
Right. Although then endorsing a stronger version of it like this runs into, well, you're running into more difficulties in actually justifying in the first place. You have to show that it's true as a matter of physics or metaphysics or something like that. But
that's right. Yeah. Right. You have to show a stronger claim in that sense.
Yeah. So then, we should then turn to the Hobbes-Edwards-Prior principle, which you call the HEPP. And so I'll just say, as you write in the paper, according to this principle, if the causal principle is false, then there'd be no good explanation for why entities do not begin at arbitrary times and arbitrary spatial locations, in arbitrary number, or of arbitrary kind. Could you introduce the idea here in a bit more detail, and maybe how this is might support the causal principle?
Right. So, here it's the logic becomes a little bit trickier because we're embedding one claim inside of another. We're embedding the causal principle now inside of a principle that's supposed to justify the causal principle. So the principle that we're embedding the causal principle inside of is called that's what I call the Hobbes-Edwards-Prior principle, the HEPP. And it's a principle according to which, had the causal principle been false, then we wouldn't have certain kinds of explanations. Right? We wouldn't have an explanation for the kinds of things that begin to exist, or for the number of things that begin to exist, or for the time at which they begin to exist, or the spatial location at which they begin to exist. And this is going back to the what happens in the Kalam literature when Craig says, if the causal principle had been false, we'd have no explanation for why raging tigers don't come out of the void. Well, he's appealing to a principle like this, right? He's saying, had the causal principle been false, then just anything, including raging tigers, could come into existence out of the void, and they could do so anywhere at any time. They could do so in any number, so you could have not just one raging tiger, but like 100. Back in history, when people were thinking about this kind of principle, so when Thomas Hobbes, for instance, was thinking about this kind of thing, so the way that Hobbes thought about this, he was concerned with the locations at which things could begin to exist. And Hobbes has this kind of funny way of talking about this. Hobbes seems to have thought that if there wasn't an explanation or reason that precisely specified the position at which something begins to exist, then that thing would begin to exist just everywhere. Now, we don't think about things that way today, right? So today we think that one and the same thing can't begin at multiple places, so that if you didn't have an explanation for it begin at one place, you could imagine multiple possible worlds where in each world it begins at a different place. What you wouldn't have is some world where something begins to exist at just every location. But in any case, Hobbes has this in mind that if you don't have a sufficient reason that tells you the precise position at which something begins to exist, then it would just begin everywhere. And since something can't begin at more than one location, Hobbes thought that this meant that had the causal principle been false, then this impossibility would have obtained. Now, in response to Hobbes, David Hume adds time. So Hume adds that it's not just the locations, but also the times in which things begin to exist. But that seems to just be a sort of straightforward extension of the principles that Hobbes already has in mind. So that's why Hume's name doesn't get to be part of the acronym. Jonathan Edwards takes up a kind of similar position, but also expands the principle. So now it's not just about spatial location or about times. It's now about the kind of things and also their locations. Not locations, the kinds of things and their number, right? So for Prior, he adds into this consideration that it could be many, many things that come into existence if there's no sufficient reason that tells you why it has to be this particular number as opposed to some other number. Now, Prior actually reins in these folks a bit. So before Prior, the idea was that it's not just substances or entities that can come into existence, but for instance, that entities or substances could undergo changes, and that it wouldn't. So, for instance, part of what someone like Edwards has in mind is that if I could raise my arm, even though nothing causes me to raise my arm, then that would be a failure of the causal principle. It means that something happens, something begins, like the raising of my arm, without a cause. And for Prior, that couldn't take place because if you had a violation of the causal principle like that, then, well, there's anything could happen or anything could begin to exist. Now, Prior, he points out that, substances are constrained by their essence or their kind to being only able to undergo certain kinds of changes, right? So maybe I can raise my arm, and maybe even if the causal principle were false, I'd be able to, my arm could begin raising without a cause. But and that wouldn't entail that other things begin to exist, says Prior. But Prior thinks that what you couldn't have, what the causal principle should really be about, according to Prior, is not just anything at all beginning to exist, but in particular substances beginning to exist. That maybe substances could be constrained in the kinds of changes that they undergo, such that if they could undergo a change for no reason or no cause, that wouldn't mean that other things could begin to exist without a cause, but that it should be that substances must have a cause for their beginning to exist. Anyway, that's some of the history of the principle.
Yeah, so actually, just one thing quickly then. It seems to me like there's almost two different but maybe related worries here about this sort of principle. One being, well, if the causal principle is false, then it's maybe no good explanation, as we say, for why these things don't begin to exist anywhere.
Yeah.
But and there's another worry that, well, if the causal principle is false, then maybe we should expect there to be this sort of chaos of things beginning uncaused all over the place. But I mean, those are separate, right? Because you could think the second.
So I think there's actually three.
Maybe a third.
That's
yeah.
right. So I think there's actually right. So I think there's three here. They're all sort of closely related, and they're all sort of related to this notion about like what kinds of explanations should we demand. So the third one is one that I already mentioned, which was that for many of these early modern authors, like for Hobbes and Edwards and so on, they had this kind of strange idea about modality, about possibility, according to which if two things are possible and there's no sufficient reason that chooses between them, then both will happen. I think, it's difficult for us to understand, I think today, like why someone would believe a principle like that, particularly because nowadays we think about modality or possibility in a different way. But I think that part of what may have influenced them was their concern about free will, right? So there's this famous example from John Buridan's ass, where we consider a donkey or an ass that's equidistant between two bales of hay. And then it's supposed to be that the donkey has just as much reason to go to one bale of hay as they have to go to the other. Now that is supposed to be some kind of a problem for deterministic pictures, whether it's hard determinism or compatibilism, whatever, that you're supposed to have the intuition that even if there's no sufficient reason, the donkey would just go to one of the bales of hay. For someone like Hobbes or Edwards, I think what they would want to say is that, well, if the donkey went to that bale of hay and there was no sufficient reason that brought them to that bale of hay, then they're doing something for which ultimately there is no cause. And in that case, the donkey would actually do both. But it's not possible for them to do both. And so it has to be that everything that happens has a cause. And I think that they'd want to extend that more generally. That's not just about whether, like when someone chooses to do something without a sufficient reason, that it's actually when anything at all happens without a sufficient reason, it would happen in all possible ways. And that's not possible. So there must be a sufficient reason whenever something happens, right? So that's one of the concerns that people had in the early modern period. I think that sort of concern is no longer appealing to us today, precisely because we tend to think about modality differently than that. It's sort of related, though, to this concern you brought up about what we should expect. Like, if there's no sufficient reason that picks out one particular thing to happen as opposed to another, then maybe we should just expect to see chaos happening. And then there's this concern about explanation. Like, maybe the concern might go like this: like, even if we don't see chaos, and even if something impossible doesn't happen, like things happening multiple different ways, multiple different incompatible ways, then maybe it's still bad if there's no explanation for the order that we see. Now, I think that there's a sense in which we can kind of unify all of those concerns together, that they're all concerns about whether there's an explanation for what happens. And the different kinds of concerns spell out why we should be concerned about explanation in different ways. But I take it that all three of those concerns are concerns about explanation. And so in all three of them, it says if you didn't have the causal principle, then you wouldn't have the kinds of explanations we'd want for why certain kinds of things begin to exist and others do not.
Good. Yeah. One thing I wanted to bring up just quickly before we move on. What if someone were just to sort of almost like bite the bullet on there being no further explanation? So like I could see someone being, maybe someone's a good Humean and they think, look, there's a Humean mosaic. There's sort of no further explanation for why it's this sort of mosaic with things mostly not beginning to exist uncaused. And there's just like no further explanation for why it's that sort of mosaic rather than some other one. That's just where explanation runs out, so to speak. I guess this will come up more a bit later. The different responses for the Humean and the anti-Humean and so on. But I don't know. What do you think of someone just sort of bit the bullet there in that way?
So this is a version of a classic objection to Humeanism. And so what's sort of funny about what's happened to the literature in at least philosophy of religion, for example, is that even though there's been a response to precisely that objection around for a long time, people haven't taken it up. People haven't noticed it. So whereas people in the philosophy of physics literature, their response is well known. So one of the ways of responding here, and as you mentioned, we can get into this more later, but one of the ways of responding is to say, look, on standard versions of Humeanism, like on David Lewis's view, there's a view about what makes one possible world closer than some other possible world. And all of the worlds that are closest to ours are going to be the ones that satisfy the same laws, or in which miracles or violations of laws are as small as possible. Things spontaneously beginning to exist all over the place would be a massive violation of those laws, right? So if you say, okay, well, in a counterfactual possibility where the causal principle is false, would things just spontaneously pop into existence out of the void? Well, not according to Humeanism as it's ordinarily spelled out, right? At all the closest possible worlds at which the causal principle is false, those worlds would still satisfy, as well as they can, all of the laws we find in the actual world, which means we wouldn't find that kind of disorder in those worlds. Now, if someone said, well, what is the probability of there being like an ordered continuation of the Humean mosaic? Well, in that case, and again, this is something we can go into more depth later, but there's a standard response according to which we're not actually justified in talking about the probability of that disordered mosaic. And so the person who thinks that the mosaic would most likely be disordered, the proof rests with them to show us why we should endorse that probability claim, because it's not one that Humeans would ordinarily grant.
Right. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And as you say, we'll definitely come back to this a bit more. So, yeah, we should introduce Neo-Russellianism, a view about causation, at least briefly. So, yeah, the basic idea is that causation is not physically fundamental, but there are real but not fundamental causal relations that help guide effective strategies. So before we kind of connect this more to the causal principle and the HEPP, do you mind elaborating a bit on Neo-Russellian and maybe some potential motivations and versions of the view that we might accept?
Yeah, Good. Okay, so Neo-Russellianism sort of is the combination of two views that existed previously in the literature. And I should say, by the way, for viewers who don't know this literature well, Neo-Russellianism doesn't originate with me. I'm just talking about a broader tradition that I happen to be particularly attracted to. Right. So in some sense, you can trace the tradition back to Bertrand Russell. That's why it has Russellianism in the name. Russell, in a 1912 article, argues that that really the way we should understand physics is such that there is no causation at all. Now, Russell, you mentioned a moment ago that the Neo-Russellian thinks that there is causation, at least at a certain level of description. Russell's position was more radical. Russell's position was what we might call a causal limitivist position. Russell thought that in sophisticated science, there's no causation whatsoever. One of the things that we shouldn't be tripped up by is that Russell isn't appealing to things like randomness. He's not saying that there's no explanations. He's not saying that things happen for no reason. He's saying that the kinds of reasons that we find in our most sophisticated sciences, in our most mature sciences, in physics, for example, don't look like causation, and so shouldn't be interpreted as causation, and that you're doing damage to the theory, to our best scientific theories, if you try to smuggle causation and if you try to reinterpret the theory in causal terms. He put it in terms of the British monarchy, that on his view, on the one hand, the British monarchy is something that is still around and that is often supposed to do no harm, but Russell thought that it was an institution that did harm, and it's an institution that ought to be gotten rid of. Now, however we might think about those political issues, Russell's point is that causation is something that people have continued to talk about even after the advent of modern physics, or at least what he would take to be modern physics, which wasn't yet what we would take to be modern physics. He doesn't have quantum mechanics in the picture, for example. But what he understood as contemporary physics has not only no use for causation, but that you distort the science if you try to reinterpret it in causal terms. We can ask, why did he think that? Here are some reasons that he thought that. So Newtonian physics, classical mechanics, some of the best physics that Russell knew in 1912, is time symmetric. So it seems like the future is related to the past in the same way that the past is related to the future. It seems like in the most detailed description that Newtonian can give us, the Newtonian mechanics rather can give us, that's the picture of the world that we get, that there's no time asymmetry, that the time asymmetry we find in our ordinary lives is not there in the most fundamental description. It's also a description according to which, it's not a description that relates particular states of affairs, right? So in our ordinary causal descriptions we might give in our everyday lives, you might say that like a brick breaks a window. That's a relationship between two very particular things, a brick and a window. But in classical mechanics, it's actually the entire past, so all of space-time prior to an event, that the event depends upon. And nothing in its past has priority. Not in the way that, for example, in the case of the window, we're imagining that the brick sometimes has priority as the cause of the window breaking, or the primary cause of the window breaking. In classical mechanics, there's nothing like that. There's nothing that picks out any particular thing that comes before any particular event as the cause. It's rather just the entire past that the event is going to depend upon. And of course, since it's time symmetric, it's also the entire future that it depends upon. Russell gives several other kinds of arguments like this, that the kinds of relationships we find in classical mechanics are unlike the way that we have traditionally thought about causation. Now, Neo-Russellians are going to retain the idea that in fundamental physics, and so here we might mean things like quantum field theory and general relativity, or whatever their future combination might happen to be, that at that level we don't have causation. But they're also going to bring in another part of the picture that they get from Nancy Cartwright. So Cartwright has a response to Russell Cartwright's response to Russell is that we can't get rid of causation in all cases. We can't be causal limitivists. We need causation, and the context in which we need causation is for determining what she calls effective strategies. The idea is something like this: is that if two things are correlated, it doesn't tell you which of the two things you ought to intervene upon in order to make a difference in the world. So, it might be that like sunscreen purchases and Nicolas Cage movies are correlated. Now, why would those both be correlated together? Well, we know that they're correlated together because people buy sunscreen in the summer, and Nicolas Cage movies come out in the summer. Sorry, I screwed up this example. Suppose we knew three things were correlated, not just the sunscreening and not just Nicolas Cage movies, but also drownings. And now the question is this. What should we, and of course the drownings are correlated with those other two because drownings also increase in the summer because people are going in the water more. What should we intervene upon in order to prevent drownings? Well, the answer to that question, in that case, is none of them. We can't intervene on Nicolas Cage movies. We can't intervene on sunscreen purchases. We could make interventions on some other things, like what happens when people go to pools. In any case, the general idea here is supposed to be that in order to determine what ends up counting as an effective strategy, what you can make a good intervention upon in order to prevent something you want to prevent, you can't just pay attention to the correlations in the world. You have to actually pay attention to causal relationships. You have to pay attention to what in that case actually causes drownings. Now, the Neo-Russellian says, okay, fine, we'll retain causal relationships at one level of description when it turns to determining effective strategies, when it turns to we might call the special sciences, when we talk about the social sciences, the medical sciences, non-fundamental sciences. And we're going to get rid of causation for basically Russell's reasons when we think about fundamental physics. And then that's going to be a picture on which causation is not a fundamental feature of the world, it's a feature of the world that has a reductive explanation in terms of fundamental physics. The reason it doesn't appear in the special sciences, or the medical sciences, or whatever, is because it's the reason it does appear there, but not in fundamental physics, is because it's not a fundamental feature of the world. I think I got my tongue a little bit tied in some of that explanation, but hopefully that made clear what the idea is supposed to be.
Yeah, no, that was good. So when we think about, well, maybe it's not worth thinking about too much right now, but when we talk about fundamental or what's fundamental or fundamental physics, I don't know. Do you have something in mind there? Is it just like our physical theories of like the smallest or things in the world? Like, does it not appear in the language of those theories? Or like, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so I don't have like necessary sufficient conditions for what it means for something to be physically fundamental. But of course, that's often the situation in philosophy, that we don't have necessary and sufficient conditions. But the idea is supposed to be something like this. Whatever the rock bottom is for physical explanation, causation doesn't appear there, right? So whatever you imagine the ultimate physical theory to be, if it's string theory, if it's something else, whatever that is, causation is absent. Now, of course, we don't have that theory, but we do have our other theories that are candidate fundamental theories by their own lights, right? Theories that, by the lights of those theories themselves, we have a picture of what physical reality might fundamentally be like. And then the idea is that in those theories that we do possess, you don't find causation in their fundamental description. And so that sort of suggests that maybe the way the world is such that we have causation at one level of description and not at another. The other thing kind of points in this direction, this one can point out, is that, well, the kind of asymmetry that we're talking about when we talk about causation is precisely it's a member of the general family of asymmetries that we've come to expect to have a reductive explanation. So think, for example, about the formation of a record, like a photographic record. So if you have one of these old-fashioned cameras where it has a photographic plate that goes inside, how does it form a picture? Well, it has to go through sort of 3 stages. It has to begin in a condition where it's ready to form a picture, what we might call the ready state, where the shutter has not yet opened yet, it's closed. The photographic plate has been loaded but not yet exposed. And then you open the shutter, you let the light in, it undergoes a chemical change, and the result is at the end a condition with which it didn't begin, one where the shutter is now closed again, the plate has undergone some kind of change, and we're now in some higher entropy state. It's undergone some irreversible physical and chemical transformation that leaves us in a new state that allows us to infer what the past was like. That kind of transformation has a reductive explanation in terms of phenomena that are not irreversible. So even though the formation of photograph itself is irreversible, is asymmetric with respect to time, it ends up in a place where we couldn't have come from. It's nonetheless underwritten by physics that's entirely time reversible. And part of the story of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics in the 19th century was coming to understand how it could be that various irreversible processes are explained by processes that are reversible, that are time symmetric.
Right. Yeah. And one more quick thing on this before we move on. What if someone were to try to argue that, well, actually, there are maybe some asymmetries in temporal asymmetries in fundamental physics, like certain weak interactions might be temporally asymmetric. What do you think about that and how that might bear on?
Right. So there is something people sometimes bring up, which is that one way to think about whether the laws obey a certain kind of symmetry is if you apply a mathematical transformation to the laws, whether or not the laws are preserved under that transformation. And it turns out if you just sort of naively go through and switch the time everywhere switch the sign wherever the time variable appears, you try to apply what's called the T symmetry, then you don't get back the same thing. You have to actually apply 3 transformations, C, P, and T. You have to change the sign in all your charge. You have to flip in a mirror, that's P, and you also have to apply your T transformation. Well, that's right. Now, there's a debate about whether or not that really has an implication about this time reversal symmetry, because what it could tell you is just that what we mean for something to be symmetric with respect to time is actually this more complicated transformation. We have other contexts in which you arguably do need a more complicated transformation that come from simpler physics, or something similar that happens in a sense in electromagnetism. And the argument there has been that we should actually just think about the time symmetry in a more sophisticated way. Another thing to be said here is that even if this meant that the physics was time asymmetric in some sense, it's entirely unclear how this is supposed to relate to anything like the asymmetry of causation. It's not enough just to have some kind of asymmetry. You have to have the right kind of asymmetry in order to get the causal asymmetry. The third thing to be said is that, so one way of talking about the asymmetry of the time asymmetry of the laws, or the time symmetry of the laws, is whether or not things look the same backwards as they do forwards. That's what this T transformation business is about. Another way of talking about them, and perhaps really the way that we should be talking about them when we talk about Neo-Russellianism, is whether gnomic determination works the same way as in forward and reverse. So the idea with gnomic determination is really this idea about whether the past depends on the future in the same way that the future depends upon the past. It could be that that claim about determination is true, even if there are certain ways in which the laws can't be reversed with respect to time. Right? Even if the mathematics has some asymmetry, that doesn't mean that determination has some asymmetry. But anyway, the standard thing that many philosophers of physics will say, that sort of standard view on this topic, is really that the laws are, in some important sense, symmetric with respect to time, and that therefore the asymmetries that we experience in everyday life, that the causal asymmetry, we should expect them to have a reductive explanation.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I would think the sort of asymmetries we would expect to explain, or that would be required for the kind of causes and causal explanations we appeal to in everyday life, are not the sort of things like, I don't know, some tiny difference in weak interactions or something. That it just is not the sort of thing that would underwrite that, I would think. Maybe larger scale things like, as you mentioned,
I mean,
you get out of thermodynamics,
need to say something.
Mechanics.
That's right. Well, they need to say something about like how it is that the weak interaction has some relationship to some like important explanatory relationship to the formation of a photographic record, to use the example I used before. And it seems like nothing important in that explanation depends on the weak interaction.
Right. Good. And then, okay, so we should move on to what the challenge or argument against Neo-Russellianism from the HEPP is. And I take it just that, well, on Neo-Russellianism, there is no microphysical causation. There's no causation at the level of the fundamental physics, at least. And so, well, then there'd be no explanation for why all these things don't exist.
That's right.
So maybe talk about.
Yeah. So and here's where it's going to be important. Remember, we were talking before about sort of those two things that can happen to the causal principle. Like, it could be that things begin to exist microphysically. And if things do begin microphysically, then we just have a straightforward violation of the causal principle, provided the Neo-Russellianism is true. And then provided that the HEPP holds, the defender of the causal principle is going to say, well, where is your explanation for why some things begin to exist and others do not? Like, isn't this weird that we don't have explanations for that kind of thing? Of course, it could be that nothing begins to exist microphysically. Now, there's some reason to think that may be what the Neo-Russellian should actually say, is that nothing should begin to exist microphysically. Now, the reason for that is that, well, if the asymmetry of time, the distinction between the past and the future, if that has a reductive explanation, then at the level of fundamental physics, in microphysically, there is no distinction then between the past and the future. And so time would just be symmetric. And if time is symmetric in that sense, we may worry that since beginning to exist is a time asymmetric notion, right? Beginning to exist involves first not existing and then existing, that nothing like that would happen microphysically. And in that case, the causal principle, it's not that it's false microphysically, but rather that it's trivially true or vacuously true. But I think that the Neo-Russellian has good reason to reject the HEPP in either case. So if it turns out that the causal principle is false, well, then the fact that there still are good explanations for why things begin to exist microphysically on Neo-Russellianism would provide the Neo-Russellian with a response. And on the other hand, if the causal principle is true microphysically, but only vacuously so, only trivially so, well, then in the closest possible worlds where the causal principle is non-vacuously false, there still would be an explanation for why things begin to exist. Right, so that gives them kind of a horn that they can depend upon. We can either consider the possibility that the causal principle is actually false microphysically, or consider the possibility that it's vacuously true microphysically, but then we consider the closest possible worlds where it's where it's false, and we see that there's still an explanation for why things begin to exist, and other things don't begin to exist, and then the HEPP is false in that case as well.
Yeah, great. So I guess I'll just raise a couple of potential challenges to those responses. First, just on the approach which says that actually microphysical or fundamental physical things don't even count as beginning to exist, and so the principle just is perhaps vacuously true, or at least vacuously true when applied in that domain. I don't know. I mean, I almost want to say that even if it's right to say that facts about beginning to exist are not facts in fundamental physics, well, okay, but we can still say that there's some microphysical arrangement or fundamental physical goings on, and it did exist at some time, even if it existing at that time is not merely a fact of fundamental physics, because maybe it being some time and not at an earlier time is something that you need more than just fundamental physics. But I don't see why that would be. Maybe I'm not explaining this well, but I don't really see why that would be that would undermine the application of the principle to that case, right? Just because the facts about it beginning to exist are not fundamentally facts about fundamental physics entirely. It might be true that something describable at the level of fundamental physics did begin to exist at that time, even though it beginning to exist at the time is not merely a fact of fundamental physics, and it began uncaused. I don't know. Do you see what I'm getting at? Maybe.
I don't quite see what you're getting at. So is this supposed to be a response on behalf of the the HEPP advocate?
Well, it's supposed to be a response on behalf of someone who thinks that things in fundamental physics, or described at the level of fundamental physics, might begin to exist uncaused, even if beginning to exist is not merely a microphysical notion or something like that.
Well, how would that work? So you're saying we're considering a possibility where things don't begin to exist microphysically. So microphysical entities, in other words, never begin to exist.
Well, there are these microphysical entities, but the idea is that
right.
The fact that they begin to exist might not be merely a fact of fundamental physics.
So you might have a view. There's a possibility I suggest in the paper, which is that someone could say, look, it's enough for something to begin to exist if, according to the direction of time you have in non-fundamental physics, that it has finite extension into the past.
Right. And I think that's sort of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So right. So in that case, you're just going to say that the causal principle is just false.
Right.
Right. Because in that case, there are things that begin to exist without causes.
Right. So then that's just, we're going to the other horn then.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And the response there, you mentioned that at nearby possible worlds also many things wouldn't be
right.
caused. Yeah.
So the HEPP is either a counterfactual conditional or a counterpossible conditional. What it's really asking about is something like this. Consider the closest possible world where the causal principle is false. What happens at that world? Is it true that at that world there'd be no explanation for why some things begin to exist and others do not, like for the locations, kinds, number, so on and so forth, for why things begin to exist? If there would still be explanations at that world, even without the causal principle, then the HEPP is false. Right? Now, that closest possible world can either be the actual world, as it would be if the causal principle is just false of the actual world, or it could be some other possible world. It could be so if the HEPP is a counterfactual conditional, then it's going to be another possible world where the causal principle is false. And if it's a counterpossible conditional, then it's the nearest impossible world where the causal principle is false, right? So in any case, what we really need to be examining is whatever that the closest possible world is, or sorry, because we want to include the possibility it's an impossible world, we should say that it's the closest world, whether possible, impossible, or actual, whatever, the closest world where the causal principle is false. We want to know what kinds of explanations are available in that world. And the idea here is that the Neo-Russellian is going to say that there would still be explanations in that world. So here's a possibility. Suppose that the direction of time had a reductive explanation. There was no fundamental direction of time. You worry about whether things microphysically begin to exist. Well, the closest possible world where something begins to exist without a cause, what that would mean is that you'd have in that world some macrophysical entity that begins to exist without a cause. And here's a way that could happen at that world. It could be that that all that exists in the world is some very large cloud of particles that undergoes thermal fluctuations, and you have some entropy minimum somewhere. The direction of time points away from that entropy minimum, and now if something macrophysically begins at that entropy minimum, then it begins to exist macrophysically, right? Because it's a macrophysical entity that has a beginning at that entropy minimum. And now you ask, would there be an explanation for why that thing began at that minimum? Well, according to the Neo-Russellian, everything is constrained by metaphysical constraints, logical constraints, and the laws of physics. Here, what's really important for us is the laws of physics. And it's the laws of physics that make it the case that thing began at that entropy minimum, as opposed to something else beginning there. So in that case, the HEPP would be false, because there'd still be an explanation at that nearby world.
Right. So the stepping back a bit, the general idea is that, look, even on the falsehood of the causal principle, that's not to say that there's necessarily no explanation for why things don't begin to exist in this way, because there could be other non-causal explanations. And here you appeal to certain law-based explanations, or maybe there's something else even. Maybe you could appeal to grounding explanations, or something else, or something in terms of essences or attributes. I mean, like, there might be other explanations for why things don't begin to exist all the time, even if the causal principle is false. And then what you mentioned there, you talk in the paper, describing the paper as this consistency principle, and according to that, it says whatever begins to exist must be consistent with the full set of logical, metaphysical, and gnomic principles. So if something's beginning to exist, if a tiger popping up behind me right now would violate laws of physics, well, no. I mean, we have an explanation for why that doesn't happen, because it would violate the laws of physics. That's the basic idea.
I'm right. I mean, so sometimes, in the literature on the Kalam argument, people sometimes want to say, well, you can't have this explanation in terms of the laws, because, I mean, they think there's sort of two possibilities that they consider in that literature. They consider the possibility of like Humean laws that are merely descriptive, and then they consider the possibility of laws that are made true by, like, the essences or the properties that individual items have. Now, it's on the one hand, we can talk about why this, why there's still a problem for them, that is for the for the causal principle advocate, even if we go with a Humean account of laws. But part of the point that I think is important here is that there are many other kinds of accounts of laws on offer, right? So in the contemporary landscape of views on laws, there are two big families. There's the Humeans, and there are the anti-Humeans. The Humeans think that all that exists is space-time and a distribution of natural qualities across space-time. And then all the laws are, they're just principles that give you a particularly good summary, particularly good description of that pattern of properties. And then the on the other hand, the anti-Humean says that no, the laws do something more. I mean, so if the laws are made true by the essences of things, that's a particular way of being an anti-Humean. It's like an essentialist version of anti-Humeanism. But you could be a different kind of anti-Humean. So you could be, so Tim Maudlin, for instance, has this view according to which there are what he calls fundamental laws of temporal evolution. And what those do is that they're responsible for producing subsequent states of the universe and past states of the universe. Viewers who know a bit of general relativity might understand, if I put it like this, that each subsequent Cauchy surface is produced through the laws from a prior Cauchy surface. Viewers who don't know general relativity can just think of this as like subsequent states of the universe being produced from past ones in virtue of the laws. And the laws, on Maudlin's view, are these sui generis, irreducible entities. They're not mere descriptions, nor are they made true by anything else. They are their own sui generis primitive entities that we need for scientific explanation, that we discovered because we're doing science and we need them for science, but they are nonetheless their own things out there in the world, and they're not somehow reducible to things in the ordinary physical world. Now, if you're a Neo-Russellian, you might not like a view like Maudlin's, because the Neo-Russellian, one reason you might be a Neo-Russellian is if you think that there's none of this time asymmetry business, right? If subsequent states are being produced from previous states, that sounds rather time asymmetric. If you're Neo-Russellian, you don't like that. Nonetheless, you might still have a view according to which the laws are irreducible primitive entities. So Eddie Chen and Shelley Goldstein have a view about laws on which laws are these kinds of primitive entities, primitive sui generis entities, like the kind that Maudlin has in mind, except that they're not laws of time evolution. They don't involve each state of the universe producing a subsequent state. Instead, what they involve are overall constraints over all of physical reality. That's a view that Emily Adlam calls all-at-once laws. If you have those all-at-once laws, then that, and we talked before about this distribution of properties across space-time, what people call the Humean mosaic. On a view like Adlam's, there are only some Humean mosaics that are allowed, and other Humean mosaics are just not in the space of possible worlds. And what explains the fact that they're not there is the fact that what the job of the laws is to give us a modal constraint, give us a constraint on what's actually possible. And given a constraint like that, then there's not going to be any of these worlds where things pop into existence for no reason. Whatever begins to exist in any possible world on a view like Adlam's is going to be constrained by whatever the fundamental laws ultimately turn out to be.
Good. Yeah. So then maybe a couple of potential concerns someone could have for this response. I mean, one is just going to be concerns that people raise for anti-Humean views broadly. I guess we don't really need to focus on that, but I mean, someone could try to point out that, well, it's like these primitive sui generis entities. I mean, it's sort of, if that's the sort of anti-Humean view you go for, it's sort of a bit mysterious what those are even supposed to be, and in what sense they govern the world. I mean, it's just maybe not a very good or sensible view.
That's right. So, so the Neo-Russellian, of course, does not have to be committed to an anti-Humean account of laws. They could go with a Humean account of laws. And, by the way, something similar happens for causation. Right? There are anti-Humean and Humean accounts of causation as well. And you could bring up that it's sort of, there's something, equally mysterious about how exactly causation is supposed to work. And so it's not clear that, like, if the way the dialectic is supposed to go is that you're defending the causal principle and doing so on the grounds that, hey, these laws are really mysterious. I don't know how it is that causation is supposed to be less mysterious than the laws are.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then let's just bring up the second concern I was thinking about. What if someone were to say, well, okay, you can appeal to these laws to explain why certain things begin to exist and others don't begin to exist uncaused. But maybe that's just pushing the explanation back a bit, because, I mean, why is it those laws rather than other ones where things did begin to exist uncaused? Maybe you would expect, on the falsehood of the causal principle, some other sort of laws. And maybe, I guess I'm sort of getting at two different potential words there. One is that, well,
yeah, and again,
you're just pushing explanation back, and then maybe it's sort of surprising that there'd be laws like this on the falsehood of the causal principle.
So I'm not sure why it would be surprising. I mean, so
maybe go something like this. Like, look, if we knew that the causal principle is false, but not what the laws were like, well, we might think that it's much more likely that you get a collection of laws which were more chaotic, right? Because there's just more ways to have things just beginning to exist uncaused all over the place than this sort of much more consistent, much more, otherwise mostly obeying the causal principle, at least on the non-fundamental level, then.
Well, it seems to me that the same thing is true about causation, right? So what happens with causation is that we want to say, these kinds of causes bring about these kinds of effects and not other kinds of effects, right? Like performing certain kinds of operations on a pile of wood, for example, results in a house and not something else. But why not something else? I mean, why is it causation? Why is these operations on that pile of wood that does that and not other kinds of operations? And why is it that there's that kind of consistency with those kinds of operations on that pile of wood? It seems to me that it's just as mysterious with respect to the laws. There's a kind of order or regularity with respect to causation, sure, but there's the sorry, I said that wrong. There's a kind of order regularity with respect to the laws, but there's also a kind of order regularity with respect to causation. And it seems to me that they're sort of on a par. I mean, what Adlam sort of nicely brings out in her papers is that this view about laws is really kind of generalization about a traditional view about causation. Right? Like what causation was supposed to do was it was supposed to constrain what was possible, which possible worlds there were in the space of possible worlds. Well, if we're taking up this alternative view about what the world is like, then it turns out that there's something else that can do that job, that can constrain what sorts of possibilities there are. Something that in some ways looks like causation, but not in every way. So we shouldn't ultimately think of it as causation.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking maybe in response to the worry that I raised, couldn't we just say something like, look, there's many different ways that, at least epistemically speaking, the laws could have been. Maybe most of them are unlike the way they actually are in certain respects, but like, so what? I mean, this is the way we, based on the data, think the laws are like. I mean, it's not so surprising that there's some details about them which are like modally uncommon. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, suppose that someone put it like this: like, suppose you knew nothing about laws, like regularities in nature, and now someone said to you, "Oh, would this set of operations on a pile of wood result in a house?" And I don't even know how to begin answering that question.
Yeah.
Right. So, it seems to me that there's a kind of parity between the two there that doesn't affect laws in a way that it wouldn't also affect causation. Arguably, I mean, on a view that I'm rather attracted to, I would say that the reason we can make those kinds of inferences about causation in the first place, or operations on a pile of wood, is precisely because the way we think about them is constrained by the laws. So the laws really are doing the explanatory work and not causation to begin with.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be discussed there, but I did want to move on to, and I guess you've talked about this a little bit already, but we should cover the Humean or Neo-Humean potential responses to the HEPP and the sort of argument.
That's right. So the HEPP advocate, the person objecting to denials of the causal principle and the basis of the HEPP. What they're presenting when they present it to the Humean Neo-Russellian is really a kind of rehashing of a very traditional objection to Humeanism. So Humeans think that each of the properties across space-time is independent of any one of the others, so you can freely recombine them. Given two possible worlds, you can generate a third possible world by combining regions in the first two. And so one region doesn't constrain other regions of space-time. Well, if one region doesn't constrain what happens in other regions of space-time, why is it that we think, what explains our relative confidence that tomorrow we're not going to wake up and like something totally new is happening in maybe the sun has turned into a dinosaur. We don't expect that to happen. That seems like a completely preposterous scenario. But on this Humean account of possibility, there's nothing about today that constrains tomorrow such that wouldn't happen. So why is it that we should expect ordered continuations of the Humean mosaic into the future as opposed to disordered continuations of the Humean mosaic? One of the responses is what I mentioned before, that there's an idea that Lewis has. So David Lewis is one of the main proponents of Neo-Humean accounts of laws. He has this idea about what makes two possible worlds closer to each other than some other world. It's in terms of whether the distribution of properties in those two worlds are more closely resemble one another. If you want to know what it was like, it would be like in some counterfactual scenario, like in the absence of causation, for example. Well, you just go to the closest by possible world where there's something that begins without a cause. And then, since that's a nearby world where the distribution of qualities across space-time very closely resembles the distribution of the actual world, it's not going to be one where you have this disordered continuation of the mosaic. Now, you might phrase the objection slightly different way. You might say, well, isn't it just much more probable that the mosaic will continue in a way that's disordered as opposed to ordered? Well, what justifies that statement? So there's two different ways you can think about probability. One is in terms of what are called chances. These are the kinds of probabilities you find, for example, in scientific theories. So when I say that, for instance, there's like a 60% chance that it will rain tomorrow, well, that's a chance in the technical sense of the word chance. There's also what are called epistemic probabilities. Sometimes people call these objective probabilities, but there's people who claim to be objective Bayesians. In any case, there's this idea that probabilities measure how, in some sense, confident you should be in a hypothesis. So you might wonder, well, how confident should I be that tomorrow will resemble today? Part of what Humeans will tell us is that our epistemic probabilities should be constrained in a particular way by the chances. This was called the principle. We might wonder here, what would it be that would constrain our epistemic probabilities in such a way that we would say that there's a higher chance tomorrow will be unlike today than that tomorrow will be like today? It certainly doesn't seem like that's from some connection between the epistemic probabilities and the chances. In the Humeans' account of chance, the chances just reflect something about the distribution of qualities across the mosaic. Nothing about that distribution is going to tell you that you should expect tomorrow to be disordered. More generally, I think the Humean is going to say that this claim that we should expect tomorrow to be unlike today, at least if it's made probabilistically, doesn't have a good justification in terms of some underlying theory. But again, if that is a good objection to the Humean, right? Suppose it turned out that we had some way of justifying those probabilities, maybe from some modified principle of indifference or something. Then it's just going to turn out that we should be anti-Humeans, and that's a view that's perfectly available for the Neo-Russellian. And so, if it turned out that we had if it turned out that we had to be anti-Humeans, that wouldn't be the end of the world either.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like, and I think you mentioned this in the paper, that some of the concerns here for the Humean or Neo-Humean response is, kind of just already existing concerns or objections that have been raised to humanism or Neo-Humanism, and not something specific to the causal principle or the HCPP. But yeah, if they are serious concerns for the Humean or Neo-Humean view, then maybe this approach shouldn't be the one that the Neo-Russellian should take. Although,
right.
I wonder what you think of the following sort of reply. So like, I imagine a Humean and an anti-Humean about the laws here, both of whom reject the causal principle. Well, like, suppose we're an anti-Humean and suppose we're an anti-Humean and we think that there's certain sorts of laws that explain why we have the regularities and things don't begin to exist on cause, yada, yada. Okay, maybe suppose that's fine. But then suppose we're a Humean or Neo-Humean and think that there is no such laws that do that explaining, but we still are convinced that those sort of regularities and generalizations about the past and the future are true.
Well, hang on. So we shouldn't say that the laws don't. So the Humean thinks the laws do explanatory work, right? So it's not as though the Humean says that the laws. They don't think the laws constrain in the sense that the anti-Humean thinks, but they do think the laws do explanatory work. In fact, in some sense, what it means for the Humean to offer, say, a scientific explanation is that you can deduce it from the laws.
Yeah. Well, some people don't think that will work, right? Because there's this worry that if you the laws are just summaries of the behaviors, and if you're using those laws to explain,
right? So there's just this circularity worry. That's right.
But regardless, maybe I shouldn't have put it quite like that. At the very least, suppose that they can't, or either the Humean or Neo-Humean can appeal to the laws to explain why things don't begin to exist on cause, or they can't. But suppose that that's illegitimate for them to make that sort of appeal. I don't see why they're in a worse position epistemically. Because, look, the only difference between their view and the given anti-Humean's view is that the anti-Humean also thinks that there are these laws, and they can deduce from those laws that these things will be true. But okay, we both agree that those things are true, these certain generalizations about what will happen in the future versus the past. They just also think there's these laws that from which you can infer that. I don't see why that's a worse view, at least epistemically. I don't know. Maybe I'm not being super precise here, but do you see the point that I'm getting at? Maybe.
Is this supposed to be an objection to the Neo-Russellian position, right?
It's supposed to be a way to a response on behalf of the Humean or Neo-Humean, to this sort of skeptical worry or something like that. If they reject the causal principle,
so it's everyone agrees with these laws. So even if they don't do the how would this work? So it sounds like you were saying even if they don't do the explanatory work, everyone still agrees that what happens has to be consistent with the laws.
Right. We agree on certain generalizations or facts about what the future is going to be like. It's just that on your view, there's something else you think is true from which you can infer that. But I don't see why that makes your view better.
That might put them in a position to say that raging tigers wouldn't pop into existence out of the void, because that would violate these generalizations that we all agree to. However, what it wouldn't do is show that in the absence of the causal principle, we still have explanations for all those kinds of facts. Right? Because in constructing the example you just gave, we're considering a case now where there isn't an explanation. So it's really important that those kinds of principles are able to do the kind of explanatory work required of them. But you could have an alternative. You could just sort of bite the bullet on the HEPP, right? You could put it like this. You could say, oh yeah, the HEPP might well be true, but who cares? Because even if we didn't have those kinds of explanations, we still wouldn't have these kinds of mysterious phenomena. It sounds like that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of getting back to what I said much earlier, where like, what if we just bit the bullet, so to speak, that there is no further explanation for these sorts of facts? And one thing you talk about later on the paper for the Neo-Humean, like, well, maybe explanation runs out somewhere, right? Metaphysical explanation.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe it runs out here. Maybe it runs out on some slightly deeper level, but like, I don't know. I mean, it's not clear to me why one is much better than the other.
That's right. So I think that's a really important point here, that a lot of this rides on like where you're comfortable with explanation running out. So the Humean, in some sense, is comfortable with that explanation running out at the level of the distribution of qualities across the Humean mosaic, and how that distribution covariates between the actual and nearby worlds. Someone like Eddie Chen or Shelley Goldstein or Emily Adlam, they're comfortable with the explanation running out at the laws, which they take to be something independent of the mosaic that somehow constrains the mosaic. And someone who endorses the causal principle is comfortable with explanation running out at the level of causation. And I guess another way you could see what this paper is doing is pointing out that you don't have to think that explanation runs out of the level of causation. It's something that's sort of strange to me about the way that, I keep alluding back to the philosophy of religion literature. Something that's been a consistent theme in that literature for the last several hundred years at least, and that's really important for someone like Leibniz, is that God supposedly is going to be able to give you this explanation for all kinds of things that we see in the world, and a sufficient reason for why things are the way they are and not otherwise. But what's strange about that sort of view is that it assumes causation instead of explaining causation. And, for folks who don't like brute facts, it's weird to me that theists are really comfortable with there being brute facts about causation. The Neo-Russellian thinks that there aren't brute facts about causation. Instead, causation has some further, deeper explanation in terms of more fundamental physical phenomena. And I think that is attractive if you're someone who dislikes brute facts.
Sorry. I mean, it's interesting you bring up some of the theological connections there, because when I was sort of had in mind something kind of related to that. Like, I don't know, when some people bring up God as an explanation for certain things, it's like, well, look, on your view, if like the universe is all there is, then there's maybe no further explanation for why there's that universe or that sort of with those sorts of laws and so on. But on my theory, where I posit God, there is an explanation. And other issues aside, I'm just like, I wonder a little bit, like, why does that make a much better theory? Just because he posit one more thing that explains the thing that's true on my theory. You know what I mean? And so I'm like, maybe something similar could be said here about laws and certain.
Well, I think what makes, so I don't know that this would strike the difference between the Humean and anti-Humean, but I think this does strike the difference between the causal fundamentalist and the causal non-fundamentalist. Hereby, causal fundamentalist, I mean someone who thinks that causation is irreducible, so it's fundamental. And the causal non-fundamentalist being someone like the Neo-Russellian. I think what strikes the difference between those two is that we're not just we're not just talking about some abstract level about like what kinds of explanations we ought to have or something. We're looking at what do contemporary physical theories that are candidate explanations for the world, what do they tell us about the role that causation plays? And it looks like, as far as the Neo-Russellian can tell, and I think this is a very attractive view, that causation is precisely the kind of thing for which we should have an explanation. And so that, I think, powerfully pushes back against the causal non-fundamentalist. Sorry, against the causal fundamentalist, rather. I confuse myself in my own terminology. But yeah, it pushes back against the causal fundamentalist, right? Because they're the one that says that there's no deeper explanation of causation. But I think it also, so it's with respect to the theology, it's interesting because it reverses the dialectical situation from the one that we usually have, right? Usually it's that the theist shows up and says, hey, like, here's something for which you atheists couldn't have an explanation, like the existence of the universe, and you have to posit that as a brute fact. In this case, we get to say, no, actually, here's something that you theists can't have an explanation of, the existence of causation, and for which some kinds of atheism, at least like Neo-Russellianism, if we combine it with atheism, would have an explanation of.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we can go on about a lot of this stuff much longer, but I mean, okay, we should probably wrap up. So maybe if you want,
do you want to talk about some examples of like non-causal explanations, or do you want to like leave those out for this conversation? Like, what do you want to?
I was thinking actually we've been going for a bit, and we could probably wrap up if it's all right. I mean, I don't know.
No, that's fine. So I'll just say here that if viewers want some examples of non-causal explanations, I go through several in the paper, including non-causal explanations of things beginning to exist that we already have in our current physical theories. So if viewers are interested in that, that's where they can look for that.
Right. Yeah, good. And some of them, I remember reading through it, and some of them are a bit more technical and but helpful. So I don't know, maybe if you want to just sort of summarize at the end here, like what do you think about the prospects for the objection to Neo-Russellianism here based on the HEPP?
Yeah, right. So I think the objections from the HEPP are made using the HEPP don't have dialectical force for the Neo-Russellian, because the Neo-Russellian can quite easily say that on their view, the HEPP is false. And false for substantive reasons that the proponent of objections based on the HEPP is kind of ignored.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a good overview. Yeah, and I do normally in these interviews, if you don't mind, with a kind of general metaphilosophical questions. I don't know. I see you get your take on that.
Yeah.
What do you think is the kind of value of philosophy? Why is philosophy worth doing, maybe to you, or more generally? Or what do you think?
Well, I think so. I think part of what philosophy offers is a kind of conceptual engineering, right? So it allows us to build better concepts so we can do other tasks better. If people want to see a really interesting example of that, they can look back at the cognitive revolution. This was the interdisciplinary work between not just philosophers, but people in other academic disciplines as well, that resulted in the construction of cognitive science as a discipline. And that was something that only resulted because people were able to get their concepts in order. They will engineer the right concepts to begin asking empirical questions. I think that philosophy is something that is best done in combination with the sciences. If we spend too much time in our armchair and too little time paying attention to what the scientists are saying, then we can lose track of what might be relevant for the world that we inhabit. And that's probably true in other areas as well, right? So if you're like a political philosopher and you pay too little attention to what your political context actually is, then you're probably working on something that has less relevance for people outside of like our narrow academic discipline. I also think, beyond extrinsic value, philosophy has intrinsic value for those who do it. So it's interesting and psychologically helpful to do, and that could be a value in its own. That's not a value that it needs to deliver for some other discipline.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I think I'll end the questions there. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Dan, and taking my questions and
yeah, this has been a lot of fun.